All right, everyone. Well, thank you again for being with us. This is the conclusion of the formal part of our Back to the Basics series. As I mentioned at the beginning of January, each January, every religious science church, now Centers for Spiritual Living, goes back to the basics. We go back and we review the 4 chapters that serve as the introduction to the Science of Mind textbook. Now, these 4 chapters kind of lay out the theory, the whole theory of what Dr. Holmes teaches. And for those who are familiar with Thomas Troward had a great deal of influence on Ernest Holmes. Thomas Troward wrote a little book called The Creative Process in the Individual. And Thomas Troward was a British civil judge who served in the Punjab in India for many years, and he kind of became aware of the similarity of ideas between Christianity and Hinduism. If you get away from the detail, if you get up high enough, you start to see how these ideas are basically saying the same thing. This is true of many religions. If we can get our head above the details, we can see that everybody's trying to tell us about love. Everybody's trying to tell us about peace, perhaps each from a different way. And in Christianity, we're taught it's done unto you according to your belief. As you think and believe in your heart, so it is. That comes from Proverbs, from the Old Testament. And this idea of our thought being creative is something that that Troward kind of latched onto. He came back to England and he didn't know that there was anybody else who even thought as he did. But there was. Remember, in the past you may have heard me speak of Ralph Waldo Trine and his little book In Tune with the Infinite, which got shipped to Europe and got translated into many different languages, and people over there were reading it. And I'm sure there were people in Europe who kind of simultaneously discovered these ideas as well. But Troward came back to England, and he was writing his notes out, thinking, I guess, about speeches or writing a book. And he went to a little tea shop, and they sat another person at his table, which they do in some places. Excuse me. In America, if you go in, if there's just one of you, and they sit you at a table for 4, they won't put 3 other people at the table. But in some parts of the world, they'll sit 3 different people or 4 different people at the table. And they did this to Troward, and the woman sitting across from him told him, said, I didn't mean to be prying, but I see that you're a student of higher thought. And Troward said, what's that? What's that, higher thought? And she said, well, the ideas you're writing, we call that higher thought. And he kind of then became aware of other people thought the same way, and he was invited to come and speak, and he gave a series of lectures. And so keep in mind what we're talking about, higher thought. If you can bring your thought to, for the sake of saying, have to say it some way higher, to a higher degree, to a higher ideal, then the experiences in your life improve. Your life changes. It's done unto you according to your belief. So anyway, Troward wrote this little book called The Creative Process in the Individual. I'm sure it's available online in its entirety. It was written in the early 1900s, so it's in the public domain by now. And he was kind of explaining how, how does the divine create? And the divine creates by an act of will and intention. And then something acts upon that will and intention, something that we would call the law of mind, something that Christian theology would call the Holy Spirit, the doer of the word. But something acts upon the will of God, or the divine, or spirit, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't make any difference to it what you call it. Something acts upon that thought and then brings about the actual physical manifestation that is the equivalent of the mental equivalent. So the outpicturing of the thought, if you will. So then the idea becomes, well, if you have this higher thought, what if your thoughts are better than the average thought? What about the law of averages? The law of averages right now is telling us, how many people are going to get sick with the flu and all these kind of things. But what if our thought doesn't dwell there? What if our thought does not dwell in race consciousness, or as Carl Jung called it, the collective consciousness? What if our thoughts were attuned to a different level. Remember, Rocco Errico tells us that in Aramaic, the word for prayer was an attunement, kind of like tuning your radio to a channel. We are tuning our consciousness to God through our act of prayer. Now, this is much different than begging, beseeching, pleading, asking, all those kind of things. Keep that in mind. Get that picture. I get the picture of the radio station there, and it's already broadcasting, and it's already broadcasting good and wholesome and perfect and kind and loving things, because this is all God can know. But we have to tune into that. We have to receive that. We have to make ourselves an instrument of receiving. This is the idea of why we must ask, believing in our hearts. Right? In the New Testament, there's a part there where Jesus tells the disciples, Spirit in heaven, the Father in heaven, already knows what you want, what you need before you ask. So ask, believing in your hearts that it is done, and it shall be done. And shall is in the form of a command, not like it might or it may, but it shall be done. If you went to a parochial school, if the nuns told you what you shall do, you knew what that meant. You shall do it. So Dr. Holmes took Troward's little book, The Creative Process of the Individual, and he restated those ideas in the first 4 chapters of the textbook. And his goal was kind of to restate it and make it a little bit more accessible to people. Troward's writings, a lot of people find difficult because much of what is written and attributed to Troward was actually transcribed from a spoken lecture. He was speaking and somebody was trying to take it down, and the inflection and the punctuation and all those things make it very difficult to read. You really can't hear what he's trying to say. You're reading somebody's trying to capture verbatim what he said. So some of the paragraphs in that book are about 1 sentence long, but there might be a dozen semicolons in that sentence. So difficult to read. So Dr. Holmes wanted to kind of restate those ideas, make them a little bit more accessible, and that's what turned out to be the first 4 chapters of the Introduction to the Science of Mind textbook. So I just kind of give you this little history lesson because I would hope that everyone wants to study more. Everyone wants to learn more. You're interested not only in what Dr. Holmes had to say, but who had influence on Dr. Holmes? Who was Emma Curtis Hopkins? Who was Thomas Troward? What did they write? Where did they get their ideas from? Where did these thoughts originally come from? Can we find these ideas back in ancient philosophy? Can we go all the way back through different religions, and can we find these same ideas expressed? Be a serious student. So today we come to the 4th chapter in the introduction of the textbook, and this, I would say, is a call to action. If you've ever been into sales or marketing, you know that you always have to have a call for action. You make your presentation, and then you would say, which one is better for you, the red one or the blue one? Which product is better for you? You're trying to move your customer to do something, to buy. And Dr. Holmes, in laying out his introduction, I would say that this chapter becomes a call to action. And he starts out straight out of the gate. He starts out and he says, there's a great danger in that we might talk about these ideas too much and use them too little. We have to use them. And he said there's 2 reasons that we have to use them. The first is that we will never know if these ideas are true or not. We will never know if they are real or not if we don't use them. And every time we do use them, the doubt, the mystery over whether this is true or not is somewhat lifted. So he gives us the example of any scientific principle. And any scientific principle starts as an intangible idea. And what he's telling us is when we come to the realm of metaphysics, this statement, there's a power in the universe that responds to us exactly according to our belief. That's an intangible idea. And it requires proof. You can't just say that. He said you can go around saying there are no sick people in the world, there's no poverty in the world. You can say that all you want, but that doesn't necessarily help anyone. This is the only way that you will know if it is true is by using it, by learning to use it. And then, of course, as you do that, then your faith grows. You deepen in your faith. So we start out and we say, well, there's a power in the universe that responds to me according to my belief. And if I learn how to use it, I can change conditions in my life. I can improve things in my life. And we get done that, and we say, well, so what? So what? So once you're done all that, so what? So basically, pretty much problems have left your life, and opportunities abound, and things are going great. Now what? Now what? See? And it kind of leads us in. We have to start somewhere. We have to start somewhere on our journey. And once we begin to realize that there's a power in the universe that responds to us according to our belief, then we want to know why. Why is this so? As St. Paul tells us in the New Testament, who am I that God is mindful of me? Why is this so? And it is in this deeper inquiry into the why that we start to truly realize that it is because we are part of that divine creation. That this soul that we are, this consciousness that is our soul, is already one with God. It is already part of the divine. It is an individualized expression of the divine. And we learn to do this with a great humility. You can understand the ego attraction and the arrogance, that we could come out and say, well, my soul is part of the oversoul, the divine soul. The very God itself is expressing its life through me. And from an egotistical point of view, we can take it the wrong way. But when we start to get it spiritually, it's not egotistical. It's humiliating, or humbling. Let me put it that way. I of my own self can do nothing. There is no power but God. I don't know. I mean, I can raise my finger and point it at something, but I don't know even how to do that. I have no idea how that really happens. I can generalize it, and I can say, well, the thought creates a nerve impulse, and the impulse travels down the nerves to the muscles that control the finger, and it makes them expand and contract as appropriate in the finger points. Yeah, that's easy to say. Now prove it. Now show me how that works. How does a thought generate a nerve impulse? How do I create a specific thought, or do I create a specific thought? We start to get into the deeper questions of life, and we truly realize then that we don't know. We don't know. We have to surrender to the truth, to the fact that we are part of something much greater than we are. And it is it that knows. And then our desire becomes simply to be at one with it, to be at one with the presence, right? We only want to be at home with the beloved. This is what Dr. Holmes tells us. He says that eventually we just come to know that the law is there. We just come to understand that it cooperates with it. We come to understand that you and I, we must take conscious control over what we are thinking, because the law is responding to us all the time, whether we choose to acknowledge it or not, whether we choose to deliberately choose or not. So then we decide to choose wisely. And then after that, all we want is to be at home with the beloved. So the reason that he tells us we have to use it, is we only know that which we can do. And once we start using it, it opens the doorway to us to a deeper experience of the presence of God. And ultimately, I think this is what we are all seeking, the experience of the presence of God. If we look across different religions, if we look across different teachings, they're all telling us in one way or shape or another, that this experience of the presence of God is the end result as far as we know, as far as the human life knows. Now this might be an experience in an afterlife, in a heaven that's far, far away in some religions, or it might be in the here and the now. It might be the mystical experience right here and right now. There's an excellent little booklet written by a monk who is known as Brother Lawrence. It was written around 1300, and there was something going on in Europe around 1300. Meister Eckhart, Hildegard, Brother Lawrence, all around the same time period, all in Europe. And Brother Lawrence wrote a little booklet called Practicing the Presence. And he wasn't smart enough to be a monk, a priest. So they made him a brother in the abbey, and they put him in charge of the kitchen. And it turned out that he was the one that we remember. He was the one who was connected. He could see God in pots and pans and in all things. He could see the love of God in his work in the kitchen. He learned that the most important thing was not to go through the ritual of the prayers for the sake of going through the ritual, but to experience the very love and the very presence of God. So we come into this realm that we call metaphysics, and we need to prove it. We need to know for sure. We can't just take anybody else's word for it. This is where the rubber meets the road, right here. We can talk about it, we can sing about it, we can hold hands and sway about it. But can we use it? Can we use it? So there's a couple things that we want to think of. In the normal course of human growth, there's a wheel of learning. And in that wheel of learning, we may enter at different points. People enter at different points depending upon their orientation towards life. Some people like to hear about a new idea, and that's their entry point. And then they take that new idea and they try to relate it to old ideas. How does this new information relate to old information? And you can see in our system of education that it's kind of built that way. So we go to school as small children and we learn simple arithmetic. We learn what numbers are. We learn about plus signs and minus signs. We learn how to add and subtract. We learn a little bit of multiplication. We learn some very simple concepts of mathematics. And then later on we start to learn more complex concepts. We might start to learn algebra and geometry and trigonometry, but all of those go back and they use and they build upon what we have learned in arithmetic. So we're learning these new concepts about trigonometry, and we're relating them back to what we knew and we learned about numbers, about arithmetic. Human knowledge tends to try to do that. We hear something new and we try to go back and relate it to something we already know. Now I will say that there's a kind of a danger in that sometimes what we're learning is so new and so different that what we already know they can't agree. One can't tolerate the other. And this is what it means you can't put new wine in old skins. It also means this is why sometimes you have to clean the house down to the foundation and start all over again. These ideas are so radical, they're so new, they're so different that the old ways of thinking, excuse me, the old ways of thinking just can't accept them. So a lot of times what you'll see happen as we go through these teachings and we go through these classes is people try to take new ideas and fit them into old ways of belief, and it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. I have seen at conferences, I have seen folks who try to take the ideas of Dr. Holmes and they try to make them fit into different types of psychology that they've studied. Oh, well, that's just like this. Well, it's not exactly. It works the other way around. You can say, well, that school of psychology perfectly agrees with the ideas that we're studying in science of mind, but it doesn't quite fit the other way. And that's the example I'm using. But nevertheless, we get exposed to a new idea. We try to see how it relates to old ideas, and then comes the part where we have to do something with it. We have to have the experiment in scientific terms. We actually have to test our knowledge. We have to try to make it work. So the example I used in the email I sent out last night is, studying geometry, and we study shapes, and we study how to calculate the volumes of shapes, and we've got all these formulas, and it's very, very abstract. When I was a little guy studying these things, I really didn't have a whole lot of use to try to figure out, what these volumes would be. There has to be some kind of a practical application. So suppose you have a flower bed and you want to put mulch on that flower bed, and you want to stack the mulch up 4 inches high. Now you have a practical application. Now you've got to sit down and you've got to measure your flower bed, and you've got to say, well, my flower bed is, so many feet long by so many feet wide by 4 inches high. Hopefully you have one that's a nice square or rectangle, but of course none of them are like that. Then you have to get into more complex analysis to figure out the shapes. But nevertheless, at some point you can use that abstract knowledge for a practical purpose. So now you figure out how many cubic yards of mulch you need, and you call a mulch company, and they come out, and you put the mulch out on the flower bed, and you find out something's wrong. Something's wrong. The truck is empty, and I've only got half as much mulch as I need. There was a misstep in my calculation. I knew about it, but I really didn't know how to use it until I sat down and tried to do it. So now I go back, see? And this is important. We don't go back and say, oh my God, I'm such a terrible person. I miscalculated the volume of mulch that I needed, How terrible am I? No, we go back and say, oh, well, I made a mistake. You go back and recalculate, and you find your mistake. Oh, there's where I made my mistake. I really needed this much mulch. And you just order the additional mulch, and they come. Now your flower bed is taken care of. There's this iterative process of you move from the abstract knowledge, you try to apply it. And in the application, in attempting to apply the abstract knowledge, you gain important feedback. I see now how to use this. I see where I went off track a little bit. I see how to bring myself back on track, so the next time I go to use this, I won't make that same mistake. This is kind of a scientific process then. So Dr. Holmes tells us then that all scientific principles start with an abstract idea, and there has to be some type of a practical application to it so we can test our knowledge and test our theories. So take something as ordinary as gravity, for example. Very few people would argue with you that there's something called gravity. I know one who will, who tells us that it doesn't exist, but he won't say why we stay stuck to the earth. Excuse me, I get a little sip of water. But we know that there's this thing called gravity, and yet we don't know what it is or how it works, or why it works, let me put it that way. We might know how it works. Newton gave us a mathematical formula, and he said the way it works is these two things that have mass are attracted to each other, and that depends on how far apart they are. Alrighty, that's good. How do you know? How do you know that that's so? So then you have the experiments, the theoretical experiment of going to the top of the Tower of Pisa and dropping two objects, one like a cannonball and then a rock, one much bigger than the other, and releasing them at the exact same instant, and having an observer down on the ground observe that both of them hit the ground at the exact same instant. Right? So the fact that one was bigger than the other didn't seem to matter. They were both being attracted to the earth at the same rate. So there's experiments that people go through. There's things that they can do, you know. And we can say, well, yeah, you know, so Newton's formula seems to hold true. But what is gravity? See? Is gravity some type of a force that exists? Is there a subatomic particle called a graviton that's inside the atoms that like a magnet attracts things together? You know, that's a theory that people had worked on for years. And then Einstein comes along and says, no, that's not the case. It's just an appearance. It's an effect. The very space-time that we exist in is curved, and things kind of move through the curve, and it appears that there's gravity. And I got to tell you, I don't understand that for a minute. But nevertheless, my point is that we don't know how gravity works. We don't know. We have this abstract idea that there's some mysterious power in the universe that brings things together. We have this idea that somehow it has to do with the mass of the objects and the distance apart that they are. But we don't even know what it is. We don't even know how it works. Now, for most people, it doesn't matter how it works. It really doesn't matter. You know, if you and I are going out here and let's say it's, you know, we're building a primitive water wheel. We decide to go back to being hippies, and we live in the country, and we build this primitive water wheel, and we want this water wheel to turn our mill. That's all we want it to do. We can sit down and we can figure out, you know, that water is flowing down the hill, and we need this much water to turn this wheel, and that once this wheel gets moving, you know, it's going to have a certain amount of centrifugal force to keep it turning, and that's going to turn the millstone, and we can build a sluice box to carry water from the stream over the water wheel, and we can make it work. And if we didn't know anything about the formulas, we might be able to figure it out through trial and success. So here we have people building water wheels. If you've seen the fish wheels up in the Northwest and up in Alaska, you know, what an amazing technology that people build this wheel that's anchored out in the middle of the river, and it spins, and it catches the fish, and it dumps the fish into a box where they can be harvested. We don't know why gravity works, but we know it does work. And I'd like you to consider this, the statement that there's a power in the universe that responds to us according to our belief in exactly the same manner. See, sometimes we get into the discussion and people say, well, but how does that work? You know, why does that work? And we don't know. It just is. Holmes tells us it just is. You know, you can't discuss why that which just is. It's like saying, why is God God? It just is. I am. The I amness, the suchness, the isness of the universe. But we can do that which is similar to what we have done with gravity, and we can say, well, if that is so, how would I know? How would I know that it is so? So we can start back then, take the wheel of learning that I laid out. We start out and we have this new information. This information says there's this power in the universe that responds to us according to our belief. Just take that as a starting point. Say, well, isn't that interesting? How would I know? Well, one thing we can look at then is what other ideas? Are there other ideas that we can explore throughout religion and throughout philosophy and throughout history that might be pointing to this same law? You know, some people seem incredibly lucky. Some other people seem incredibly unlucky. You know, does their outlook towards life actually bring them into circumstances and events that are either lucky or unlucky? As I say, we are told in the Old Testament, in Proverbs, we are told that as you think and believe in your heart, that's how you are. As you think and believe in your heart, in your subjective or subconscious mind, not your conscious mind, but your subjective or subconscious mind. We are told in Buddhism, everything you have experienced is a result of what you have thought. If you go back and look at any of the popular self-help and psychology teachings, starting with, you know, in the early 1900s on, and coming through Dale Carnegie and How to Win Friends and Influence People, and through W. Clement Stone and Napoleon Hill. Napoleon Hill wrote his book Think and Grow Rich. after interviewing Andrew Carnegie and many of Andrew Carnegie's friends, one of whom was Henry Ford, and Henry Ford read Ralph Waldo Trine's In Tune with the Infinite. Henry Ford liked it so much that he bought it by the box load and by the box and gave copies to all of his business associates. These very successful people, profiled in Think and Grow Rich, were telling Napoleon Hill, the secret is your intention. You have to make up your mind. Napoleon Hill gave us a very precise formula to follow, to write down your specific intention, what it is that you intend to do, what it is you intend to have, and to read this to yourself twice a day for 20 minutes twice a day, sort of to program your subconscious mind. Napoleon Hill says the reason that his system works is because there's a spiritual law behind it, but he's not going to go into the spiritual law because people might think he was trying to convert them to a different religion, which he was not. Nevertheless, you have in pop psychology and self-help literature, you have this theme that consistently runs that says if you change your thinking, you will change your life. It is done unto you according to your belief. When I was learning how to sell, when I was a salesman, you had to believe you were going to make that sale. You had to get up and go out the door that morning believing that this day was going to be a success. Any human endeavor, anything that has been done, well, maybe there's a few accidents, but almost anything that has been done by people who believe they could do it, because the people who did not believe that they could do it would not even attempt. The Wright brothers believed that they could solve all of the problems they needed to solve in order to demonstrate controlled flight. Now, that wasn't anything new. There were people all over the world trying to figure out how to control flight, and they were killing themselves while they were doing it. They were building big wings. They were dragging them up to the top of a mountain. They were getting on them, and people were pushing them off the cliff, and they would start to glide down, and they would go okay for a little bit. And then all of a sudden, a gust of wind would tip one of the wings up. They had no ability to control it, and they would crash and they would die. And the Wright brothers took a different approach. They were bicycle mechanics. They understood about balance, and they started to approach this idea of controlling flight as one of balance. They watched the seagulls down at Kitty Hawk. The seagulls would hover in the breeze, and they would warp their wings. They would twist their wings, and through twisting their wings, they would change the amount of lift on the wings, and they could control their balance. And the Wright brothers adopted that approach. They believed they could do it. They believed they could do it. Even after they did it, there were people who didn't believe they did it. And of course, there was a prize at the time. Rich people were offering, excuse me, a great prize. So one of the Wright brothers packed this plane up, put it on a ship, took it over to France, assembled it, and flew it around a racetrack in France, demonstrating that he could take off, he could land, and he could control and maneuver it in flight and make it go where he wanted to go. And then after that, shortly after that, other people started flying. Back in the 50s, Roger Bannister was training to break the 4-minute mile in track and field, and people said, you can't do it, it can't be done, it's physiologically impossible, the human body can't move fast enough to do that. Nevertheless, Bannister believed he could do it, Bannister did it, and within a few months' time, several other people did it as well. Something shifted in human consciousness, something shifted in the human belief. And once that shift in consciousness took place, the demonstrations started to appear, whether it be planes flying or track and field athletes running the mile in less than 4 minutes. So we start out with this idea. This idea says there's a power in the universe that responds to you according to your belief. Why it does so, we don't know. It just does. Right? Why gravity is gravity, we don't know. It just does. But that doesn't stop us from working with gravity. That doesn't stop us from harnessing the power of gravity. That doesn't stop us from building dams on river to generate electricity. Electricity is another intangible idea. We start with this idea there's a power in the universe that responds to us according to our belief. We look around other religions and other philosophies and we say, well, I can see how other things might be pointing towards that. I can see why, Norman Vincent Peale's The Power of Positive Thinking. I can see why that would work. If there's a power in the universe that responds to us according to belief, then yes, the power of positive thinking would produce positive results in our lives. Thomas Trollard's higher thought, positive thinking. I can understand that. I can understand when I go back and I look at the book of Genesis when it tells us that God spoke its word, let it be, and it was. I can understand that if there's this power in the universe that responds to us exactly according to our belief. And then the question becomes, to me personally, so what? So what? Well, here's the what. Here's the important part. If this is so, if this is true, it is responding to us exactly according to our belief all the time. All the time. Not just when we want it to. Gravity doesn't work for us just when we want it to. You know? Wouldn't it be nice if you started to drop something and it's heading towards the floor and you could say, okay, gravity, turn off for a little while. Let me grab this thing before it hits the floor so I don't have to bend down and get it. Right? Now, gravity's working all the time, whether we want it to or not. The earth is rotating all the time, whether we want it to or not. The law of mind is responding to us exactly according to our belief all the time, whether we want it to or not. So the first so what for us, the first what's in it for me, is that we should choose to work consciously with it, because it's working with us whether we are conscious of it or not. And this is what Dr. Holmes tells us. We need to take conscious control of what we're thinking and what we are believing. We're born into this world, we grow up in an environment, we're taught by our parents, our teachers, our peers, our TVs, radios, and all these things, and we are bombarded with all of these different ideas and opinions all throughout our life. But how many of them have we actually taken responsibility for? How many of them have we actually stopped and asked ourselves, why do I believe that? Is that so? You know, did I just pick that up, kind of, pick that up in the environment that I grew up in? Why am I biased in this particular way? Why do I think that this food is good and that food is bad, etc.? Or these people are good and those people are bad? Why do I believe what I believe? See? And this is the hard part for many of us. We're going to go back and ask yourself, well, why do you believe what you believe? And our society doesn't want to do that. Our parents told us because I said so. Our teachers told us because that's the answer the book is looking for. But now, in order to be responsible adults, we have to go back and say to ourselves, why do I believe that? How do I know what I believe? Well, the simplest way is look about your life and say, everything in my life is the sum total of what I believe. This law is responding to me whether I know it or not, whether I choose my thoughts deliberately or not. So if that's true, if that's so, and I'm using the word if because I'm suggesting that each and every one has to make this discovery for themselves. Too much talk and too little application is not good for us. How would I know? How would I know if this is so? And the only way that you're going to know, well, there's two ways. One is you can kind of hang out with other people who believe it and who are using, deliberately changing their thoughts and producing changes in their lives. That's what our spiritual community is all about. But ultimately it comes down to you. You have to do it. Nobody can do it for you. You have to do it. So you have to ask yourself, do I just want to feel good thinking that there's a power in the universe that responds to me according to my belief? That I'm not just kind of a victim of race consciousness and caught up in whatever the world has going on? I mean, there's a certain feel good in that. No, that doesn't apply to me. Well, it does unless you deliberately choose to change your thoughts, you see. It does. So now you have to decide, am I willing to make the experiment? Am I willing to find something or things in my life that I will deliberately and consciously decide how I will believe, and I will work with myself every day to produce that change in my belief until I see the demonstration in my life. That's very important. Dr. Holmes says, treat until you see the demonstration. Treat every day until you see the demonstration. Every day treat to know that you've already done a treatment. Every day treat to know that your treatment is in action. Every day treat to know that the demonstration is unfolding. But continue, change your mind and keep it changed. Continue to keep your mind changed until you see the results in your life. And it may be something simple at the beginning, And sometimes people will come in class and say, does this mean I can walk on water? Sure it does, if you believe it. How long is it going to take you to develop that belief? You better sit down now and get started. But if you believe it, sure. Maybe you want to start with something simpler. Right? Because like we used to set the objectives in corporate America, stretch objectives. They can't be so far out that you know you can't make it. And they can't be so easy that you don't have to do anything different in order to make them. So what is it that you would like to do? What is it that you would like to see in your life that you are willing to become a scientist? Remember Holmes started out and called us religious scientists. Explorers, spiritual explorers in the uncharted territory of mind. If there's a power in the universe that responds to you exactly according to your belief, how are you going to know it? Beyond reading about it, beyond talking to other people who are using it, how are you going to know it? And the only way that you're going to know it is to deliberately choose to change something that you're thinking. Even if you're not consciously aware of what you're thinking, you know what the results are in your life. That may be something with health, it may be something with wealth, it may be something with relationships, it may be something with your job, it may be something with your spiritual path. Those are the key areas that people usually request treatment. Pick something in your life, pick one thing in your life that you're willing to stay with, that you're willing to practice, that you're willing to go in and sit down and say, now how do I bring my thoughts, how do I bring my belief in a different direction? And of course this is the process of treatment that we teach. But it's not the only process, right? You got to find your process. Holmes gives out treatment and says, this is a process to use till you find something better. This is because someday we'll be there spontaneously, right? Someday we will just know and it will appear. Someday we will just know and our conditions will change. But for now we're learning and we need a process to learn. So for some people it is an audible process of treatment, it is words. For some people it is a visual process of visualization. There are affirmations that we can use to help shake up our disbelief and break it up. And there's meditation that we can use to just simply be at home with the beloved. Which of those will you use? What is it that you wish to see happen differently in your life? What are you willing to do? As Sean Connery in the movie The Untouchables, he played the Irish beat cop in Chicago, he kept saying to Elliot Ness, what are you prepared to do? What are you prepared to do? What are you prepared to do to make this experiment? What are you prepared to do to take this theory that we've been talking about and to test it for yourself? What is it you want to have happen differently here? Don't get caught up in the abstract of, well, I don't know how it works. Remember, you don't know how gravity works, but you know how to walk in it. What is it that you want to have happen differently in your life? And what are you willing to do to change your belief? Holmes tells us that any further progress that we are to make must be based on using what we already know. There comes a point where we can go no further until we take what we have learned and we have put it to practical use. There's no sense me going on to study calculus if I haven't mastered arithmetic, if I haven't mastered algebra and geometry, trigonometry. I have to take what I know and I have to prove to myself that I know it, and I have to gain the feedback from the experience of trying to use it. Then I can take that. See, that's the fourth step, the feedback, the fourth step in the wheel of learning. Then I can take that and I can say, now I have a new understanding. I have a different understanding. I have a better understanding. And now I can go back into the first step again. I can open my mind and my heart to another idea. Then I can start to move on to the next step of the exploration, which, who am I that God is mindful of me? Then I can start to move into the mystical experience of experiencing the presence of the One. Now, if we could just jump immediately into that mystical experience of being in the presence of the One and being united with the presence of the One, we would not need a process. So some teachers will say, just go straight for the mystical. Don't worry about anything else. Just go straight for the mystical. And I understand that. And there's value in that. But there's also value at times in understanding and using a process. And I switch back and forth between the two. So I invite you this year, I guess I invite you to consider, what is it you want to do, or do you even want to do it? Do you want to grow more deeply this year? Do you want to grow more deeply into your experience of the presence of God? Do you want to take these ideas that you're hearing about and put them to the test? Not just feel good about hearing about them, but do you really want to put them to the test? Do you want to make something happen in your life? Not necessarily for the sake of making a change in your life, but as Holmes tells us, to demonstrate the superiority of spiritual thought over the material world. And then what are the implications of that? Think about that. Is walking on water possible? Sure. Demonstrate the superiority of spiritual thought over the physical world. What this does is it just helps us break out of the mindset that we are only human. God is all there is. God expressing through us and as us is all there is. We of our own selves can do nothing. But we have to go through the steps of crawl, walk, and run in order to get there. Now, in the late 1950s or the mid-1950s, I can't remember when it was, Dr. Holmes was retiring from his public ministry. And he gave his last official address at the Asilomar Conference Grounds in California to the annual retreat. And this has become memorialized as the Sermon by the Sea. And for those of you who've been there, you know what I'm talking about. This conference center is built on the dunes in Pacific Grove, and it overlooks the Pacific Ocean. And it was there that Dr. Holmes gave his last public sermon, the Sermon by the Sea. And in it he said, can you imagine what would happen if we had 1,000 people who understood and used what we were teaching? And he was talking about for the purpose of building an organization to teach. And I thought that was interesting. Here was a man who had been publicly teaching for well over 30 years. And he said, what would happen if we got 1,000 people together to focus together? He was still imploring people to use it. The very beginning words that he wrote, he was imploring people to use it. The very last public words he spoke, he was imploring people, use it. Use it. Dr. Holmes had a weekly radio program and then a television program. And his opening line was, there's a power for good in the universe, and you can use it. I invite you then to make this year, 2018, the year that you use it. And of course, if you need any help doing that, that's what we're here for. You just give us a call or shoot us an email. Pick something in your life. Be willing to sit in treatment at least once a day for it until you see the result, until you see the change. Right? The purpose of treatment is to create the avenue within your own consciousness through which the change occurs. It is only in using it that you'll be able to go the next step. This is the year. This is the time. And so it is.